I am delighted to welcome to this I Am Eden video in our series, a highlight of our faculty, and in particular, Christopher Grundy, who is our professor of liturgy and preaching, and who is our associate dean of the chapel, and a longtime colleague and dear friend of mine. And it is a real treat to be able to celebrate in this conversation about Christopher's publication of this important book about Holy Communion, the wonderful book, Recovering Communion in a Violent World, Resistance, Resilience, and Risk. What a great contribution to the field of liturgical theology and practical theology in terms of worship and the practice of communion. We are really celebrating this big accomplishment.
Thank you, Deb. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. Excited about this stage where I get to sort of go out and talk to churches and various people about what's in it and think with them about what it might mean for their congregation.
If you could just give us a little bit of an overview of the origin and, as you understand it, the purpose for this book.
So the origin begins in church. It begins, my work as a local pastor and noticing the people who didn't take communion. I heard stories of a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, oftentimes traumatic violence. So the project really got started both to try and help people that I was talking to who were struggling with communion, but also to find a way of presiding myself that felt okay, but felt true, that felt like this feels like honest theology to me. This feels like how I think the world actually works, and a way of doing communion that I can be comfortable with. So I've been working on that, and the book is a lot of that journey of deconstruction, of sort of taking things apart and trying to figure out what the problems are, but also then later on trying to figure out, so what are we going to do? There's so many things about Holy Communion that are good and worth hanging on to. How do we find ways to hang on to what's best and maybe recover aspects of the tradition that have been subjugated, have been covered over, that may be useful to us.
What is it that you are most excited about recovering? And do you think that the church today needs to recover in this practice of resistance, resilience, and risk?
At the heart of the book is an assertion that meals were really important to Jesus and his community in their ministry, but that they never intended for the meals of faith to form people in ways that they would learn how to benefit from the violence done to Jesus. And they would learn in the process how to benefit from violence done to others. But that was just not a part of the ministry of Jesus. And yes, the crucifixion does change things, and we can't pretend like the crucifixion didn't happen. I think that's a big danger, especially in communities of privilege, like I have been formed in, right? That we want to sort of benefit from the life of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus, and we don't really want to talk about the cross. And there's some real pitfalls there. But at the heart of the book is this assertion that this was an important part of Jesus' ministry. They didn't intend it to be about benefiting from crucifixion. Instead, there were ways that they wanted to do meals that formed people in what in the book I call sort of the habitus of the beloved community of God. How our instincts for living are shaped by our environment. So if you do something over and over, it shapes you in some ways that you recognize and ways that you don't recognize. So like the meals themselves were a means of spiritual and practical formation, and trying to recover what those were in the ministry of Jesus, and imagine that we can focus on those, not forgetting about the crucifixion, but pushing through the crucifixion to continue doing the things that Jesus intended. That's really where the book is aimed at. And so the habitus of actually learning to share your own food, actually learning to sit and eat with people that you wouldn't ordinarily eat with, those kinds of very practical things that shape us is really at the heart of the book and the possibilities that I'm hoping churches will consider.
What do you hope to be the impact of this work? Where do you see this going?
On a level, I hope that there are people who are able to find their way back to Holy Communion because they have ways of understanding it and ways of enacting it. On a communal level, yeah, my hope is that churches will begin experimenting, not just in conversation, but actually trying new forms of Holy Communion. The book quotes Millard Fuller, the founder of Habitat for Humanity, who said, people more often act their way into a new way of thinking than they think their way into a new way of acting.
Really want to get into a little bit as a faculty member at Eden Seminary.
Okay.
To talk to you because I feel so much that this book is really evidence of the kind of resource that the curriculum and faculty at Eden are intending to create with and for the church, with and for the progressive Christian movement. So when we think about the seminary's infused goals, which are becoming, in a sense, the seminary's sort of guiding principles around not only curriculum, but all of our programs and really our way of being in the larger community, United Church of Christ, the church. How do you see this book as a kind of companion with those goals, or maybe a product of that way of thinking? I mean, how do you see this book and your scholarship in light of the mission and purpose of the seminary?
Go through those infused goals. The first one is racial equity and intersecting oppressions. Mm-hmm. And when I think about racial equity in particular, I think about how important Dolores Williams was in this work for me. Just the concept of surrogacy, her idea that it's not okay for some people to suffer for other people, especially in systems where they don't get to choose that. And Jesus, you know, a lot of the New Testament is trying stridently to claim that Jesus did choose it. But there's also a lot in the text that would lead us to believe that he was arrested against his will, suffering on behalf of, and you can draw a line from, you know, antebellum slavery all the way through our contemporary systems to show the ways in which people are made to suffer for other people. Tracy West is an African-American Christian ethicist, and she, in one of her books, raises this really hard question, right, about whether participating in Holy Communion in a white or predominantly white church reinscribes white people in white supremacy, in white privilege, because they learn, here's someone who is willing to suffer and die for you. Isn't that great for you? And that, you know, that's deeply problematic. And in her book, she talks about it. It's deeply tied to all of the experiences outside of church that people are bringing with them. So there's a connection between what we learn about other people suffering for us and what we learn at the table about other people suffering for us. The parallel, and I think I see this in some of the writings of James Cone, right, is if you think that you can get together with just privileged white people in a church and have a meal and think that it's actually the Lord's Supper, you are deceiving yourself. So I think of 1 Corinthians 11. There's a strong call in there for us to rethink what makes the meal sacramental, what makes it actually Holy Communion. Our tendency is to think, oh, well, it's Holy Communion if you say the words of institution, if somehow the bread becomes the body and blood of Jesus. Paul is saying you could do all that, and if you get together with just your privileged friends and you actually humiliate the people who are actually hungry, he says that, right? You're humiliating the people who are getting there later because they're actually hungry and they show up and there's no food for them. He's like, that's worse. That's worse than nothing. If the second one is interfaith collegiality, I would connect that to the way in which the meal that, the type of meal that I see it being possible to recover in the New Testament is much more about what our colleague Dr. Niles calls going on pilgrimage to find God, going out to find God, than in just gathering in an upper room by ourselves. In some ways, the upper room story does us a disservice because it causes us to miss the fact that most of the meals of Jesus' ministry were actually reaching outward to people. We're going out to find different kinds of people, often people who weren't supposed to sit at the same table. That kind of go and encounter the stranger because the divine may be there, that's going to apply to all sorts of people. That's going to apply to our neighbors who are of different faiths. That's going to apply to our neighbors who are of no faith. We may still be going out in search of the divine, encountering the divine in all sorts of people. So the third infused goal is vocational resilience. And of course, this book is really founded on a theology of resilience. The vocational resilience is a lot about sort of being able to hang on to our vocation in spite of the fact that a lot of bad things are going to happen. Things are, a lot of bad things in ministry, a lot of bad things in our own walk of discipleship, a lot of bad things in the church, which after all is full of human beings that do all sorts of things that are less than perfect, right? And how do you continue in the face of all that? The first time that you really hurt someone, the first time that you really make a bad mistake, how do you keep going? And the part of the discovery of this project is that we see not just in Jesus, but in Jesus' community, a kind of resilience in the face of violence and disappointment and even death that boggles the mind and leads us toward the possibility that all of this happens. People are scared and they run and they hide behind locked doors, but they manage to come together and continue. And when they do, they find that the ministry of Jesus continues, and in some sense, Jesus continues in their midst. All of that leads them to this possibility that perhaps God is able to be resilient in the face of the crucifixion, in the face of all that we do wrong. And so for me, that theology of resilience and the resilience of the vocation of the original community around Jesus is deeply tied to our hopes for the vocational resilience of our graduates who go out into a very uncertain church and are going to have to be incredibly creative, but also incredibly resilient.
So this is a book, I hope you all can hear, that can sustain hope for you in these times, can encourage you, particularly around the practice of Holy Communion, to engage the tradition in ways that help you see the formations that have been complicit with empire, with domination, with violence, and the opportunity for the church to journey with Jesus and really move into the Spirit's call to human freedom.
I am grateful for the meals of the Spirit. I am grateful for the resilience given by that Spirit. I am Eden.